It wasn't just about the loneliness, it was the silence in our bed, the absence of touch that once made me feel alive. Ethan's distance left me yearning for connection, and when we finally came together after months apart, it was like rediscovering each other's bodies, each other's hearts. But even in the heat of passion, I couldn't escape the shadow of the choices I'd made, and the truth I still needed to face. Before we dive into this powerful story, let us know where you're tuning in from, and if you find it compelling, don't forget to hit subscribe. I didn't know silence could feel this loud. When Ethan left for his business trips, it wasn't just his absence that filled the house. It was the void he left behind. First, I thought I'd get used to it, but tonight it was suffocating. The ticking of the clock, the hum of the fridge, even my own breathing felt amplified. I couldn't take it anymore. Grabbing my jacket, I slipped outside. The cool night air wrapped around me, and the scent of freshly turned earth filled my lungs. The barn stood ahead, illuminated by the moonlight filtering through the trees. Its faint golden glow spilled from the cracks in the wooden doors, calling me. The moment I stepped inside, the familiar scent of hay and leather enveloped me. It was as if the barn itself welcomed me, offering a reprieve from the weight of the empty house. And there he was, Dakota. He stood in his stall, his chestnut coat gleaming in the dim light, his dark eyes calm and steady. Dakota wasn't just a horse. He was a presence, a grounding force I didn't know I needed until now. "Hey boy," I murmured, my voice soft, almost reverent. Dakota flicked his ears at the sound, shifting slightly as I approached. I reached out, letting my hand glide over his mane. It was coarse but warm, and for the first time that day, the tension in my chest began to ease. I grabbed a brush from the nearby rack and began grooming him, my movements slow and deliberate. Each stroke seemed to smooth not just his coat but the edges of my own thoughts. The silence of the barn wasn't like the silence of the house. It wasn't oppressive. Here it felt alive, filled with the quiet sounds of Dakota's breathing and the rustle of hay. As I worked, my thoughts drifted to Ethan. It had been a week since he left, and though he'd called a few times, our conversations were brief, perfunctory. "How's everything at home?" he'd ask. "Fine," I'd reply. And that was it. The distance between us wasn't just physical anymore. It felt like a chasm I didn't know how to cross. "You don't ask for anything, do you?" I said to Dakota, my voice breaking the quiet. He turned his head slightly, as if to acknowledge me. "You just give." The words surprised me. I hadn't realized how much I needed to say them until they were out in the open. When I finished brushing him, I leaned against the stall door, watching him. His dark eyes met mine, and for a moment I felt seen. Not judged or pitied, just understood. It was a strange, comforting feeling. The barn seemed to wrap me in its warmth, and I stayed longer than I meant to, letting the peace settle over me. But eventually I had to leave. As I stepped back into the night, the cool air biting at my skin, I turned for one last look. Dakota stood in the soft glow of the barn light, watching me. For the first time in days, I didn't feel so alone. The barn wasn't just a place anymore. It became my refuge. Each evening, after the house had grown quiet and the weight of the day settled on my shoulders, I'd find myself heading down the familiar gravel path. It was almost instinctive, as if something in me knew the barn was where I needed to be. Dakota was always there, waiting. His soft nicker greeted me as I opened the door, the warm light from the barn spilling into the night. The earthy smell of hay and leather surrounded me, grounding me in a way nothing else could. "Hey boy," I whispered as I approached his stall. He turned his head, his large, soulful eyes meeting mine. There was something about his gaze, steady, unwavering, that made it feel like he understood me in a way no one else could. I ran my hand down his mane, letting its coarse warmth settle my restless thoughts. Started with brushing him. Each stroke of the brush became a ritual, a quiet moment of connection that eased the ache in my chest. The rhythmic motion, the soft sound of the bristles against his coat, it all worked to calm the chaos in my mind. One night, as I brushed him, I spoke into the quiet. "Do you ever feel stuck, Dakota? Like no matter how hard you try, you can't move forward?" My voice broke on the last word, and I stopped, swallowing the lump in my throat. Dakota flicked his ears, his gaze never leaving me. I let out a shaky laugh. I know. You're just a horse. But still, It's nice to pretend someone's listening. After brushing him, I'd sit on a bale of hay, leaning back against the wooden stall. The barn was quiet, save for the occasional rustle of hay or the soft sounds of Dakota shifting in his stall. It was in those moments of stillness that I found a kind of peace I hadn't felt in years. The house, in contrast, felt colder than ever. Ethan's calls had become shorter. His tone clipped and distracted. I stopped asking when he'd be home. It didn't seem to matter anymore. The distance between us had grown so vast I wasn't sure if we could ever close it. Sometimes I think I come here just to feel something, I confessed to Dakota one night. My voice was barely above a whisper, but the words felt heavy, like they'd been waiting to escape. Is that crazy? He didn't respond, of course, but the way he looked at me, calm, steady, made me feel like maybe it wasn't so crazy after all. One evening I decided to take him out for a ride. It had been months since I'd last ridden, but the thought of feeling the wind on my face called to me. I saddled him up, the leather creaking softly as I adjusted the straps, and led him out into the cool night air. The moon hung low in the sky, casting a silvery glow over the fields. As we galloped across the open land, the world seemed to fall away. The rhythmic pounding of Dakota's hooves matched the beat of my heart, and for the first time in a long time, I felt alive. When we slowed to a stop near the edge of the property, I leaned forward, resting my forehead against his neck. "Thank you," I whispered. The words felt small compared to the weight of my gratitude, but they were all I had. Over the following days, my visits to the barn became longer. I started staying past sundown, tracing patterns in Dakota's coat with my fingers while the barn grew quiet around us. I didn't want to leave. Didn't want to return to the empty house where silence felt more like a prison than a reprieve. "This is enough, isn't it?" I asked Dakota one night, my voice trembling. "You and me here. It's enough." But even as I said the words, I felt the lie in them. This wasn't enough, not really. But for now it felt like all I had. As I made my way back to the house that night, I turned to look at the barn one last time. The warm glow of the light spilled through the cracks in the wooden walls, and Dakota's silhouette stood in the doorway watching me. For a moment, I thought about turning back. But I didn't. Instead, I walked into the cold, silent house, knowing I'd return to the barn again tomorrow. It started subtly, so quietly I didn't notice at first. A moment here, a lingering thought there. It wasn't anything dramatic, just a shift, like the ground moving beneath me, almost imperceptible until it wasn't. One evening I stood in the barn, running the brush down Dakota's sleek chestnut coat. The barn was still. The only sounds the soft rustle of hay and Dakota's steady breathing. I moved methodically, but my mind was elsewhere, replaying the last conversation I had with Ethan. He called earlier that day, his voice flat and perfunctory. "Just wanted to check in," he said. "Everything okay?" "Fine," I replied. The word felt hollow, but it was all I could muster. There was a pause before he spoke again. "I'll be back on Thursday." "Okay," I said, and that was it. No warmth, no connection. Just words spoken across a chasm I couldn't see the bottom of. I set the brush down and leaned against Dakota, my forehead resting lightly against his shoulder. His warmth seeped into me, chasing away the cold knot in my chest. "You're the only one who really listens, you know that?" I whispered. He turned his head slightly, his deep, steady eyes meeting mine. I felt a lump rise in my throat, and before I could stop myself, the words spilled out. "Sometimes I think I'm disappearing, Dakota. Like I'm fading away, and no one even notices." The tears came suddenly, hot and unrelenting. I buried my face in his mane, the coarse strands dampening against my skin. Dakota didn't move, didn't flinch. He just stood there, steady as always, as if holding me up when I couldn't do it myself. "I don't know what I'm doing," I choked out. I feel so lost." For a long moment, I stayed there, letting the quiet of the barn and Dakota's calm presence wrap around me. When I finally pulled away, my cheeks were flushed, my breath shaky. I wiped my face with the sleeve of my flannel shirt, forcing a laugh. I must look ridiculous. Dakota's eyes stayed on me, and for a moment I felt like he understood. It was a ridiculous thought, but it stayed with me as I finished tidying the barn and headed back to the house. That night, as I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, I couldn't stop thinking about the barn, about Dakota. I hated how much I looked forward to seeing him, how much I relied on those quiet moments in the stall. It felt like crossing a line, but I wasn't sure what that line was or if I'd already crossed it. The next evening, I took Dakota out for another ride. The wind whipped against my face as we galloped across the open field, the rhythm of his hooves echoing in my chest. I felt a rush of exhilaration, a freedom I hadn't felt in years. It was just the two of us moving as one, and for a little while nothing else mattered. When we returned to the barn, I slipped off the saddle and ran my hands down Dakota's neck, feeling the heat of his muscles beneath my palms. "Thank you," I murmured, my voice barely audible. I wasn't sure what I was thanking him for, the ride, the solace, or something deeper I couldn't quite name. Over the following days, the line between comfort and something else grew blurrier. I found myself lingering in the barn longer than I needed to, brushing Dakota's coat even when it was already smooth, just for an excuse to stay. One evening, as I sat on a bale of hay, watching Dakota in the soft light of the barn, I whispered, "You're my escape, you know that?" The words felt heavy, dangerous, like they held a truth I wasn't ready to face. Dakota turned his head toward me, his ears flicking as if in acknowledgement. My chest tightened, a confusing mix of guilt and longing settling in. I stood abruptly, brushing the straw from my jeans. "I should go," I said, my voice shaky. As I walked back to the house, the barn light glowed behind me, warm and inviting. I paused at the door, glancing over my shoulder. Dakota's silhouette stood in the doorway, watching me as always. For a moment I thought about going back, but I forced myself to keep walking. The silence of the house greeted me, and I knew it would be waiting for me again tomorrow. But so would Dakota. And that thought stayed with me long into the night. The rain came down in relentless sheets that evening, hammering against the windows and soaking the ground outside. It had been a long gray day, the kind that felt heavy on my chest. By the time dinner was done and the dishes were stacked neatly on the counter, I couldn't sit still anymore. The barn was calling me. I threw on my raincoat and boots, grabbing a flashlight as I stepped out into the storm. The gravel path was slick and uneven under my feet, but I didn't care. The barn loomed ahead, a sanctuary of light and warmth amid the chaos of the storm. When I pushed open the door, Dakota greeted me with a soft nicker, his ears flicking toward me. I stepped inside, the familiar scent of hay and leather enveloping me, instantly calming the restless energy swirling in my chest. "Hey boy," I murmured, running my hand down his neck. His coat was warm under my touch, his calm presence steadying me. I grabbed a brush from the rack and began grooming him, my movements slow and deliberate. The sound of the rain on the roof mixed with the soft rhythm of the brush against his coat, and for a while, it felt like the rest of the world didn't exist. I didn't hear the car pull up, didn't notice the headlights cutting through the rain. It wasn't until I heard the crunch of gravel and the unmistakable sound of a car door slamming that my heart dropped. Ethan wasn't supposed to be home until tomorrow. I froze, the brush still in my hand, as the barn door creaked open. Ethan stepped inside, his rain-soaked coat dripping onto the floor. His eyes scanned the barn before landing on me, and for a moment neither of us spoke. "What are you doing out here?" he asked finally, his voice cutting through the quiet. I swallowed hard, setting the brush down and wiping my hands on my jeans. "I couldn't sleep," I said, avoiding his gaze. "The storm. I thought I'd check on Dakota." Ethan's eyes flicked to the horse, then back to me. His expression was unreadable, but I could feel the tension radiating from him. "You've been spending a lot of time out here lately." "It's peaceful," I replied quickly, too quickly. "It helps me clear my head." He nodded slowly, his gaze lingering on me for a moment longer before he stepped back toward the door. "Dinner's inside," he said, his tone clipped. "You should come in before you catch a cold." The barn felt colder after he left. I leaned against the stall door, my heart racing in my chest. I couldn't shake the feeling that he'd seen something he wasn't ready to name, something I wasn't ready to admit. The next morning, the tension between us was palpable. Ethan barely spoke during breakfast, his focus on the newspaper in front of him. I picked at my food, the silence stretching between us like a taut wire. Finally, he set the paper down and looked at me. "Sam," he began, his voice low but steady, "we need to talk." My stomach dropped. "About what?" I asked, though I already knew. You know what? He said, his eyes searching mine. Something's been off. You've been distant. Different. I opened my mouth to respond, but the words wouldn't come. He leaned forward, his elbows on the table. You can talk to me, he said. But I need you to be honest. Is there something you're not telling me? I swallowed hard, my chest tightening. It's nothing, I stammered. I've just been stressed. He studied me for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Stressed, he repeated. His voice was calm, but there was an edge to it that sent a chill down my spine. Is that all? Yes, I said quickly, too quickly. That's all. Ethan didn't reply, but the look in his eyes told me he didn't believe me. He stood, grabbing his coffee mug and heading for the door without another word. That evening I found myself back in the barn, my hands trembling as I brushed Dakota's coat. The tension in the house, in Ethan's words, was suffocating. But here with Dakota it was easier to breathe. What am I doing? I whispered, my voice breaking. The words hung in the air, unanswered, as Dakota's deep eyes watched me. For the first time, the peace I found in the barn felt fragile, like it could shatter at any moment. And I wasn't sure I'd be able to put the pieces back together. The house was unusually quiet the next morning, the kind of quiet that felt heavy and foreboding. Ethan and I moved around each other like strangers, speaking only in clipped phrases about mundane things. The tension hung in the air like a storm waiting to break. After lunch, Ethan set his mug down with a deliberate clink, breaking the silence. Alyssa, he said, his voice calm but firm. We need to talk. My heart sank. About what? I asked, though I already knew. He looked at me, his eyes searching mine. I don't know how to say this, so I'm just going to ask. What's going on with you? You've been distant, different. It's like you're here, but you're not really here. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. I don't know what you mean, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. Ethan leaned forward, his elbows on the table. Don't do that, he said softly. Don't pretend you don't know what I'm talking about. You're not the same, Alyssa. And I don't think this is just about me being gone. My stomach twisted into knots. I'm fine, I said quickly. Too quickly. It's just stress. That's all. Stress, he repeated, his tone skeptical. He let out a long sigh, running a hand through his hair. Look, if something's going on, I'd rather hear it from you than figure it out on my own. I felt the weight of his words settle over me, heavy and suffocating. For a moment I thought about telling him everything, the loneliness, the nights spent in the barn, the connection I felt with Dakota that I couldn't explain. But the words caught in my throat, tangled in fear and guilt. There's nothing to tell, I said finally, my voice hollow. I'm just tired. Ethan leaned back in his chair, his jaw tightening. I want to believe you, he said quietly, but I can't help feeling like there's more to this. That evening, I went to the barn earlier than usual. My hands shook as I opened the door, the familiar scent of hay and leather doing little to calm my racing heart. Dakota greeted me with a soft nicker, his large, steady eyes watching me as I approached. Hey boy, I murmured, running my hand down his neck. His coat was warm under my touch, and for a moment the weight in my chest eased. But the memory of Ethan's words lingered, sharp and cutting. I leaned against Dakota, my forehead resting against his shoulder. What am I going to do? I whispered. The words felt small in the quiet of the barn, swallowed by the stillness around me. For a long moment I stayed there, letting Dakota's calm presence ground me. But the peace I usually found in the barn felt fragile tonight, like it could shatter at any moment. When I returned to the house, Ethan was waiting for me in the living room. He was sitting on the couch, his elbows resting on his knees, his hands clasped tightly together. His eyes met mine as I stepped inside, and I knew I couldn't avoid this conversation any longer. Did you have a good time in the barn? He asked, his voice even. I hesitated, the question catching me off guard. Yeah, I said finally. It was fine. Ethan nodded slowly, his eyes never leaving mine. Alyssa, he began, his voice softer now. I don't know what's happening with us, but I need you to be honest with me. If there's something you're not telling me, now is the time. I felt the tears prick at the corners of my eyes, but I blinked them back. I don't know what you want me to say, I said, my voice trembling. I feel lost, Ethan. And I don't know how to fix it. He stood, his movements deliberate as he closed the distance between us. Then let me help you, he said, his voice earnest. But you have to let me in, Alyssa. You have to let me be part of this. For a moment I couldn't speak. The vulnerability in his voice, the plea in his eyes, it was too much. I'll try, I said finally, my voice barely audible. I don't know how, but I'll try. Ethan reached for my hand, his grip warm and steady. That's all I'm asking, he said. Just try. As I stood there holding his hand, I felt something shift. It wasn't a solution, not yet, but it was a start. And for the first time in a long time, it felt like maybe that was enough. The barn felt different that evening, quieter somehow, as if it knew what was coming. I hesitated in the doorway, my hand resting on the worn wooden frame. My heart heavy with the weight of the conversation I'd had with Ethan. He had been patient, understanding even, but his words stayed with me. You need to figure out what you want, Alyssa. Not just for us, but for yourself. I stepped inside, my boots crunching softly against the hay-strewn floor. Dakota stood in his stall, his chestnut coat catching the warm light filtering through the slats in the barn walls. He turned his head toward me, his ears flicking forward in greeting. He always seemed to know when I needed him most. Hey boy, I murmured, my voice breaking. I stepped closer, reaching out to run my hand down his neck. His warmth was familiar, comforting. But tonight it wasn't enough to chase away the knot in my chest. I grabbed the brush from the rack and began grooming him, my movements slow and deliberate. The rhythmic strokes were soothing, grounding me as I struggled to find the words I needed to say. You've been my rock, you know that? I whispered. You've been there for me when I felt like I was falling apart. Dakota shifted slightly, his steady eyes meeting mine. The lump in my throat grew tighter, and I swallowed hard, forcing myself to continue. But I can't keep doing this, I said softly. I've been using you to fill a hole in my life, and it's not fair to you, to Ethan, or to me. The words hung in the air, heavy with the truth I'd been avoiding for so long. I leaned against Dakota, my forehead resting against his shoulder, and let the tears fall. I have to let you go, I whispered. I have to let myself go. That evening, I sat in the barn longer than I should have, tracing the lines of Dakota's coat with my fingers, memorizing every detail. The quiet was soothing, but it also felt like a goodbye. I knew I couldn't keep coming here. Couldn't keep leaning on him as my escape. If I wanted to fix things with Ethan, if I wanted to fix myself, I had to face the silence I'd been running from. As the sky outside turned dark, I finally stood, brushing the hay from my jeans. Thank you, I said, my voice trembling. For everything. Dakota nickered softly, his ears flicking toward me as I stepped back. I took one last look at him, his chestnut coat glowing in the warm light of the barn, his steady gaze watching me as if he understood. Then I turned and walked out, closing the door behind me. Back at the house, Ethan was waiting for me in the living room. He looked up as I walked in, his expression cautious but hopeful. How was the barn? He asked. I hesitated, the weight of the evening pressing down on me. It was hard, I admitted, but I think it was the right thing to do. He nodded, setting his book aside and patting the seat next to him. I crossed the room and sat down, the silence between us no longer feeling like a chasm, but a bridge we were slowly building together. I want to make this work, I said softly, my voice steady despite the emotions bubbling beneath the surface. But I need you to know that it's going to take time. I have a lot to figure out, and I need you to be patient with me. Ethan reached for my hand, his grip warm and reassuring. I'm not going anywhere, he said simply. We'll figure it out together. That night, as I lay in bed beside Ethan, staring at the ceiling, I felt lighter. The ache in my chest was still there, but it didn't feel so overwhelming anymore. I knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy, that there would be moments of doubt and days when the pull of the barn and Dakota would feel impossible to resist. But for the first time in a long time, I felt like I was moving forward. Letting go wasn't just about leaving Dakota behind. It was about making space for something new, something real. It was about learning to face the silence, not with fear, but with the hope that I could fill it with something better. And as I closed my eyes, Ethan's steady breathing beside me, I knew I was ready to try. 3 months had passed since that night in the barn, and though the ache of letting go hadn't completely faded, it no longer consumed me. Each day felt like a small step forward, like the weight I'd been carrying was slowly lifting. Ethan and I were rebuilding together. Counseling had become a lifeline. At first, I was hesitant, afraid of what it might reveal. But those sessions taught us how to talk again. Not just about the surface-level stuff, but the deep things, the fears, the frustrations, the dreams we'd let slip away. For the first time in years, it felt like we were truly listening to each other. Ethan had softened in ways I hadn't expected. He started asking questions, real ones, about how I was feeling, what I needed. And I learned to let him in, to share the parts of myself I'd been hiding. It wasn't perfect. Some days were harder than others, but we were trying. And that was enough. I still visited Dakota occasionally. I couldn't let him go completely. He'd been too important to my journey. But now those visits were different. They weren't about escape anymore. They were about gratitude, about honoring what he'd given me without clinging to it. One quiet afternoon, I stood by his stall, running my fingers through his mane. "You're still my favorite," I whispered, smiling. Dakota nickered softly, nudging my shoulder in response. I laughed, the sound lighter than it had been in months. When I turned to leave, I saw Ethan leaning against the fence outside, watching me. His arms were crossed, but there was no tension in his posture. His eyes met mine and he smiled, the kind of smile that said he understood. "How's Dakota?" he asked as I approached. "Good," I replied. "He's Dakota. Steady as always." Ethan nodded, his smile softening. "Kind of like us now," he said, his tone teasing but warm. His words caught me off guard, and I felt a lump rise in my throat. I blinked back, the tears threatening to spill, and smiled back. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, we sat together on the porch, the air cool and still. The sky was painted in hues of orange and pink, and for the first time in a long time I felt at peace. "Do you think we'll be okay?" I asked softly, breaking the silence. Ethan looked at me, his eyes steady and filled with something I hadn't seen in years, hope. "I think we already are," he said. And for the first time, I believed him. It wasn't perfect. Never would be. But it was real and it was ours. As I leaned into him, the weight of the past months finally lifted, leaving only the quiet promise of something new. Together we'd found our way back. And for the first time that felt like enough.